You know what's strange about Gen X? They're often described as the forgotten generation, sandwiched between the booming numbers of boomers and millennials, and yet quietly shaping much of the world around us. Consider this for a moment. While millennials are celebrated for their tech savviness and social consciousness, and boomers for their influence and authority, Gen X seems almost invisible in popular narratives. But psychologically, they are fascinating, and understanding them offers subtle insights into human behavior, adaptation, and identity. At first glance, Gen X might appear to be just another generational label, people born roughly between 1965 and 1980. But if you look closer, patterns in their behavior reveal a deeper story of resilience, skepticism, and adaptive intelligence. They grew up in an era of paradox, rising divorce rates, shifting social norms, and the birth of personal computing. They witnessed the rise of cable TV, the fall of Cold War certainties, and the emergence of a digital world that would eventually reshape how we work and communicate. Psychologists often describe them as highly independent, yet quietly anxious about stability. This tension between autonomy and uncertainty is a core psychological feature of the generation. Here's something interesting. Research on personality traits across generations shows that Gen Xers tend to score high on adaptability, self-reliance, and skepticism. Cognitive psychologists suggest that these traits were likely shaped by early life experiences. Many Gen X children grew up as latchkey kids, returning from school to an empty house while both parents worked. This experience fostered early independence, but also a need to monitor and regulate their own emotions without much adult guidance. In terms of brain development, experiences like these can strengthen the prefrontal cortex, which helps with planning, problem-solving, and self-control. But they can also heighten sensitivity to uncertainty and social cues. In other words, their brains learn to navigate complexity early on, making them flexible but cautious. Consider the social dimension for a moment. Unlike millennials, who grew up immersed in social media and constant connectivity, Gen X witnessed the slow evolution of technology. They were the first generation to experience video games, home computers, and the internet as teenagers or young adults. This gave them a unique perspective. They were comfortable with change, but not dependent on it. Their social networks were built more through trust, shared experiences, and selective communication, rather than constant virtual validation. Some researchers call this intentional social engagement. Psychologically, this explains why many Gen Xers are excellent at reading social dynamics. They notice patterns, pick up cues, and often prefer smaller, deeper circles of connection over large, performative networks. Now, think about the professional world. Gen X entered adulthood during a period of economic uncertainty, the rise of corporate downsizing, globalization, and shifting job markets. Psychologists studying career motivation often note a pattern. Gen Xers value autonomy and competence over titles or authority. This is partly a response to witnessing job instability firsthand, and partly an internalized lesson about control and resilience. They learn to trust their own judgment, which can sometimes be misinterpreted by younger or older generations as cynicism or detachment. But in psychological terms, it's actually a sophisticated strategy for adaptation. If you can't rely on external structures, you invest in internal resources, skills, knowledge, emotional regulation. Here's something you might not realize. Their skepticism isn't just about the world, it's also about self-perception. Many Gen Xers developed what psychologists call a realistic self-schema. Unlike the overly optimistic or idealized identities often seen in millennials, Gen X tends to have a nuanced understanding of their own limitations and strengths. They can assess risks, anticipate outcomes, and adjust behavior without needing external validation. This reflects a subtle but powerful psychological trait. They are self-reliant not in arrogance, but in quiet pragmatism. But there's a paradox here. Despite their independence and resilience, many Gen Xers struggle with recognition and cultural visibility. Their behavioral patterns, pragmatic, understated, self-sufficient, don't always translate into social attention. Neuropsychologists might argue that this aligns with dopamine-driven feedback loops. Humans often respond more strongly to visible reinforcement, and generations like Gen X, who weren't trained on social media reward cycles, may experience less external validation for their efforts. Psychologically, this doesn't reduce competence. It just means they are less externally celebrated, which can be frustrating in a world that thrives on visibility. Let's reflect for a moment on identity and emotional regulation. Gen Xers often balance multiple paradoxes: independence versus desire for connection, skepticism versus hope, adaptation versus nostalgia. Behavioral studies suggest that this balancing act leads to subtle emotional intelligence. They may not always express emotion outwardly, but they are adept at reading situations, predicting social responses, and managing interpersonal tension. In families, workplaces, and friendships, they often act as stabilizers, people who quietly understand others without needing to dominate or perform. This skill is deeply rooted in both early life experiences and their ongoing adaptation to complex social and technological changes. You might wonder, how does this generational psychology matter for understanding human behavior today? The answer is surprisingly practical. Gen X's approach to problem solving, skepticism, and adaptability offers a lens into modern stress coping strategies. For example, research shows that people who grew up with moderate exposure to uncertainty, like many Gen Xers, tend to develop higher cognitive flexibility, meaning they can switch strategies effectively when conditions change. Their capacity for self-reliance, combined with selective social engagement, reflects a behavioral model that emphasizes both internal control and strategic cooperation. Essentially, Gen Xers embody a psychological blueprint for navigating a rapidly changing, sometimes unpredictable world. Here's a reflective question. When you look at your own behavior, or that of someone in your family, could you be seeing traces of this generational adaptation? Maybe you notice a preference for independent thinking, pragmatic problem solving, or quiet skepticism. These are not just personality quirks. They are adaptive patterns shaped by both environment and cultural history. Understanding this can help us see human behavior not as random or fixed, but as responsive and deeply contextual. As we approach the end, it's worth noting that Gen X psychology reminds us of a subtle truth about human nature. Identity, resilience, and adaptation often operate in quiet ways, beneath the surface of social visibility. Not all influence is loud. Some of the most impactful behavior comes from observation, pattern recognition, and strategic adjustment. In families, workplaces, and social groups, Gen Xers often act as the connectors, the stabilizers, the thinkers who anticipate complexity and adjust accordingly. Their psychology illustrates that human intelligence is not only cognitive, it's social, emotional, and deeply adaptive. So next time you hear someone dismiss Gen X as the forgotten generation, consider this. They may not be the most visible, but their behavioral patterns and psychological adaptations have quietly shaped the modern world. Their capacity for self-reliance, nuanced thinking, and social insight offers a mirror to our own patterns of adaptation. Reflecting on this, we realize that human behavior is rarely linear or dramatic. It's often subtle, strategic, and quietly profound. And in that subtlety lies one of the most fascinating aspects of our shared psychology. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more insights into psychology, human behavior, and the patterns that shape everyday life, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and take your understanding of psychology to the next level.